In the lecture, I focused very much on an overview of the framework that economists have about corporate culture in general. And I took a very long view. I started with some examples, and then I looked at the literature on theory of corporate culture. And what I noticed is that many of these theories are lacking some fundamental ingredients that we see in firms. They're all about identifying culture as a coordination device to induce certain equilibrium behavior of agents, but many of the features that we see in practice are actually lacking in the literature. So I thought that this was a perfect venue to discuss what a good theory of corporate culture should have, given that the Institute has this great ability to attract practitioner, legal and economic scholar, because in some way the anecdotes show that corporate culture requires a number of layers. It requires modeling the behavior of entrepreneurs and workers, but it requires thinking about what is the role of corporate governance, and also how these agents get together in an institution that has a specific goal. It's not any other institution, has a production function, and in many instances we can think of the culture as the way to define the boundaries of the firm. It's actually quite debatable to what extent culture is the reflection of the local culture. So if we go back to the literature, Hofstede showed to us that by examining IBM different offices, he identified a very different culture from each one of these offices around the world, implicitly telling us that to some extent local culture comes into firms. And this actually tells us a very important thing, which is that every worker joining a company in a way is bringing his or her own social identity. And so the first layer is certainly the local culture. Then we have the equilibrium culture that comes through recruiting. So if you're recruiting tech, innovative, you're gonna see that you're gonna draw from the local population, but the certain characteristics. But then managers, there is a lot of evidence that managers deliberately screen and then train. So there is two dimensions. One is the screening for specific culture, and then the other one is the imposition of culture. So that's the last layer, and I showed today an example of a change in culture where managers were able to shift the equilibrium, but those are generally rare evidence. Generally all this happens in an organic way, and so for researchers it's very hard to measure how much of a culture is the result of a deliberate decision of the entrepreneurs or the managers, characteristics of the local culture, or something spontaneous that emerges. I think we have some very obvious examples of managers that or entrepreneurs, generally in family firms, where the initial culture is really very much the founder culture. And there is a lot of examples, and Amazon, which is another example that I mentioned today, really strongly believes in these leadership principles. They are repeated and rehearsed. The interviews are based on these principles and so on. And so you have a founder there that has a belief that culture is essential. And in that way, I think we have a very strong example of type of firms that do that. You know, generally the cases of a change in culture emerge after crisis. It's like, you know, how do we restore a sense of integrity, a sense of trust after we have a big corruption incident? You know, I mentioned the Siemens case. You know, how do you do that in order to, you know, to make sure that the entire workforce is going to shift in terms of the equilibrium? And then you really require having someone that has the ability to prioritize in a credible way. But you know, what I said today was that culture is a constraint in some way. So you know, the manager cannot just simply state a certain culture and then do something else. We have a lot of examples of that, of companies that mention integrity, but in reality they're caught doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. And so, you know, the most successful one are the one that really define culture and prioritize culture, and then really live to it in a very sustained way. I don't know if they do. We have some evidence, including some work that I have done, but you know, in some other research that shows some correlation between certain values of culture, positive values of culture, and performance. But in reality, as academics, as I mentioned today, we know very little about whether it is a reverse causation. In other words, the firms that are really high profitable, you know, that have a high profitability, they can afford investing in culture, or is it really that culture leads to higher profitability? But I don't know for sure. This is a perfect venue to ask you know, the investors who are here as well. You know, that's the great thing about the Institute, to bring together different players, whether indeed this is going to be a factor in the decisions that are made by the investors. I'm trying to work out, you know, is likely more sophisticated version of corporate culture, which is what I debated about, you know, during the lecture. But one of the other area of research that I'm doing right now is to look at the evolution of corporate elite, mostly in the US, starting from 1900, and looking at the characteristics of the management and how this has shifted over time. Well, one of the biggest challenges is data, because what the little research that has been done has shown that what companies put on their web page is not reliable. When we have what the company put in the web page and what workers say anonymously, the two things don't match. So the first challenge for researcher is to make sure that they can get reliable data to study this concept. Without that, it's going to be very difficult. And so getting together with firms that are willing to share data unconditionally, and especially those that really believe in culture and they want to make, to show that there is an impact, I think you know, that's the number one thing from an empirical point of view. Oh, you know, this is the perfect place to have this discussion about the frontier, because many of the questions that are difficult to tackle, like this particular one, require a lot of brainstorming early on and different perspective. And I think what the ECGI has done is to really bring practitioners, academic of different background together, and you know, the conversation are really very enriching, and so that is a really big result of meetings of this type. And the fact that they could actually combine conferences and the annual meeting together is actually it brings together many more people, and that's an excellent idea. I'm very, very pleased with that.